Hi everyone, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 21st, where we are putting some closure onto Oedipus the King, getting ready to begin our next drama, and that happens to be Midsummer Night's Dream. And I hope that at this particular point in the semester, you have completed your reading with Oedipus the King. Though we saw a production, you know, a production is never a substitute for actually reading the play. And at the ending of the drama unit, you will be writing a journal response, much like you did with short story. However, this would be an informal journal response, so it wouldn't be much like a paper. And I'm in the midst of grading your papers now. I'm returning them to you. So I hope to put some closure to that by the ending of the week. As you all know, you have the option of rewriting the first paper, which I'm evaluating both for grammar and mechanics as well as content. I just ask that you submit in the original copy of the paper with my comments on it so that I can compare and contrast with your revision. And you would have up until the ending of the semester to do that, but obviously the sooner the better for everybody involved. And what that would mean is that our second paper, which will ultimately be on drama, will be due at the very ending of the semester after you have submitted in a journal response to all three dramas, approximately a page or so response to Oedipus, and then Midsummer, and then finally Raisin in the Sun. And then I would return that to you. And then at that particular point in time, you could decide whether or not you wanted to utilize some of your journal writing for your second paper, which will be very similar to what you did with your first paper, except of course you would be writing about drama rather than writing about short story. And I'll be providing you with some sample paper topics soon. That paper, your second paper, would be due at the very ending of the semester, so there probably wouldn't be time for a revision, though occasionally I've been able to negotiate with students, and depending on when you get the paper in and what your situation is, there might be an option. But ultimately the idea is that the first paper is the learning exercise, and that's your short story paper, which is why you all have the option of revising it. And then your second paper, you're just putting into effect what you learned with your first paper. Where that would put us in the semester when you're writing about drama is that we will be talking about our last literary unit, and that happens to be poetry. We're going to be reading a series of poems, and then after that, we would have a journal. Again, I'll ask you to choose three. Three is the magic number in this class. Three of the poems that we discussed in class, and to write approximately a page or so informally on each of the poems that you happen to select. But we would have run out of time because this will be at the very ending of the semester. But we do have a final exam scheduled. And what that means is that the final exam is the place where you get to focus on poetry. In fact, I can tell you what the final exam is now. What I'm going to do is select a handful of the poems that we've discussed in class, and I'm going to ask you to choose two of those poems and to analyze them in depth. So it will be an open book, open note examination, so you can use things like your journals, which would also have my commentary on them by that point, or your class notes. It would be very similar to writing a paper. The difference is that you wouldn't necessarily have 2 weeks to be able to work on it. So I don't expect something to be as polished or as developed as something you would do at home. Since this is an online class, you would have 24 hours to do that final exam. If we were taking the final exam in class, that would be a 2-hour final exam. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about the final. This will be 80 points of the final, the two poems that you respond to, 40 points per poem, which leaves 20 points, 10 points for a shorter question on short story, 10 points for a shorter question on drama. So that would be a way that we could holistically sort of finish the semester. So that's what's coming up, and my hope again is that you have finished reading Oedipus the King and that you are in the beginnings of reading A Midsummer Night's Dream. What I'll do next class is give you a little bit of an introduction to Shakespeare, and then we will watch a production, and the hope is that that will help inform your reading so that once we're done watching performance, then we can talk about the plot. I'm well aware that Shakespeare is challenging, But I also am well aware this is not an introduction to Shakespeare class. It's an introduction to literature class. So I'll make sure that we all have an understanding of the plot, even though the audience watching A Midsummer Night's Dream might not necessarily know the plot ahead of time. It was very different from Oedipus the King. And we talked about some of the reasons why Oedipus the King required us to know the plot ahead of time. If nothing else, it was because of some of the limitations of the theater at the time. That would house, or could seat, I should say, thousands of people in a Greek amphitheater. So it would be very possible that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see or perhaps hear everything, even with the marvels of the acoustics of Greek theater, once you've got a theater that's packed with thousands of people. So if you happen to miss part of the plot in watching a performance of Oedipus, it really wouldn't be a major issue because you already know the plot. Kind of liken it to a sermon where you already know the sermon, but you're just listening to it again so that the morals get reinforced, and also because you want to see the unique treatment of that particular sermon, even though you're aware of the story. When we get to Shakespearean theater, we'll talk a little bit about his very famous Globe Theater and how that influenced performance for his plays. But going back to Oedipus the King, you'll see in the notes below, I've got another video version of Oedipus. I don't expect you to watch it. It's from the BBC, the British Broadcasting Company, and they happen to be a premier interpreter of literature. And in fact, they had quite an extensive project with putting all of Shakespeare's plays on film, and these are the most accurate representations that exist of Shakespeare's plays. So, and luckily our library allows us to stream all of those for free. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about that as the semester goes on. The reason why I wanted you to see the other production, or at least know that it exists, and there are other productions as well, though there isn't anything that's particularly contemporary. I think that's a way that Hollywood has really missed out, because there's so much drama and intrigue in this particular play that I think they can make it very meaningful for contemporary audiences, and that really hasn't been done yet. But at any rate, if we were meeting in person, I would have you watch 10 minutes of the BBC version, probably the last 10 minutes after Oedipus gouges out his eyes, just so you can see a different interpretation. You'll see that the translation, obviously, is much more contemporary and less poetic. You'll see that the acting is more modern. You'll see that the actors are performing without masks. You'll see that the costumes are more contemporary as well. The chorus, actually, they're dressed like judges. They look like a judicial court. And perhaps that's appropriate for the ending of the play, when the chorus serves a function of not just being community, but also serving as commentator on action. But you'll also look at the notes below. I draw your attention to Aristotle. He was probably best known for philosophy, but he was perhaps also one of our first literary critics, and had identified Oedipus the King as perhaps the greatest example of tragedy that had ever been written up until his lifetime. And a tragedy, from his perspective, because he defined the elements as to what he thought made a great tragedy, would be about complex, terrible, and piteous events. And I think we can say that Oedipus the King is complex. It is about terrible and about piteous events. And according to Aristotle, a great tragedy would have a tragic hero. That would be a great man who's above and beyond the ordinary, who is much greater than any of us are. And this would be important so that we feel a certain level of pity for this character. Because if they were an evil character and they experienced descent, and of course tragedy is about descent, well then ultimately we wouldn't feel any pity for this character. But this is a good man who's above and beyond the ordinary. So not only do we feel pity, but we also feel fear, because if this person can experience a descent and they're above and beyond any of us, then we can experience a similar descent, or maybe even worse. So we've got a great man who's above and beyond the ordinary and experiences a downfall because of two elements: a flaw or flaws in character, And I think flaws are much more accurate. There are specific actions this character takes to help bring about their downfall. But there also is some sort of outside force that is beyond their control. Oftentimes we call it fate. And that said, you can see how Oedipus the King, even though it's such an old play, does examine some of the contemporary issues in our religions and in our philosophies about how do you reconcile free will versus predetermination, for instance. If there is a fate, does that mean that fate or destiny is predetermined and we don't have any individual free will? That we believe we do, but basically everything has already been predetermined for us. Or is it that we do have a certain level of choice or free will, but there happens to be foreknowledge. So some higher power knows the events that are going to occur, but they aren't necessarily influencing what the events are. And when we think about our own lives, we oftentimes talk about the idea of what we can do to help improve our situations. And obviously there are errors or flaws that we can avoid to help improve our situation. But then there are also outside forces, the things that we cannot control. Sometimes instead of fate or destiny, we call them luck. But if we think about the tragic hero would have a combination of the two. And for Oedipus the King, he has quite a few flaws, but probably his biggest flaw is hubris. And hubris means arrogance, excessive pride. And this is one of the ways that the play is perhaps difficult to understand from a contemporary perspective. Understand that we are watching a play from 430 BC Greece. So it was a very different world, a world of the gods in the plural. And the idea is that the gods basically determined actions and the fruition of fate. And it was up to humans to be humble and accept their fates. That said, we know that Oedipus does not accept his fate when he is told that he will kill his father and marry his mother. He does everything in his power to prevent it. And from our contemporary standpoint, that's exactly what he should do, everything in his power to prevent it, because this is a horrific event. But from the Greek perspective in 430 BC, his arrogance in trying to change his fate, his arrogance in trying to outwit the gods, is what brings about his downfall. And that's probably his biggest sin. That's not to say that Oedipus doesn't have other sins either. We know that he has a quick temper. We know that he is very irrational. We know that he commits murder. On the most surface level, I suppose one of the major lessons of the play is you don't murder people. We know that Oedipus lives in denial, that this is a truth that he does not want to see, so he doesn't see it. We know that Oedipus is even blind to the truth, and I use that language deliberately because vision and blindness is so important in terms of the play. And that said, while he's got multiple flaws, probably hubris is the one that is identified as his major flaw, but that'll be our attendance question today, actually, which will be due on Thursday, the 23rd at noon. Again, if you need an extension, let me know. What do you think Oedipus's biggest flaw happens to be, and why? But at any rate, this tragic character who has flaws, but also has to work with outside forces, experiences a descent. I think it's pretty clear that Oedipus experiences descent by the ending of the play. And we as audience, again, feel pity because it's not all of their fault and they're a good person. And we also feel fear because if this could happen to them, it could happen to us. Some of the other elements, according to Aristotle, that are important for a tragedy is that the characters be necessary and engage in probable actions. In other words, to try to be as realistic as possible, understanding that, of course, we are suspending disbelief when we are watching a drama unfold, but the characters should act in a way that seems to make sense for their characters on stage. So if someone tends to be a dependable character, they should continue to be dependable unless there's some sort of life-changing event that would change that. Likewise, if someone is fickle, then they should remain fickle throughout the entire play. Again, unless there's some sort of life-changing event that would change their behavior. There was even something called the unities of time and place that Aristotle talked about, that we already have to suspend so much disbelief and use our imaginations to pretend that the theater is indeed a location, such as Athens, Greece, that once the play begins, it should have the unity of time. In other words, we spend approximately an hour and a half to 2 hours watching the play unfold. That should be the length of time of the action in the play. The play shouldn't take place over weeks or months, because obviously we're not sitting there for weeks or months or years watching it. We're only there for a couple of hours. Likewise, unity of place. Once we've established that the stage is supposed to represent a particular locale, we stay in that locale and we don't move from that locale. So again, so we don't have to stretch our imaginations too much. This is important in terms of understanding how all of the dramatists after Oedipus approached tragedy, which is one of the reasons why we're reading Oedipus the King, not just because of its philosophical questions, but also because of its historical relevance in terms of establishing tragedy. And probably the most well-known tragedist is Shakespeare himself. And when we think about Shakespeare, usually people identify his plays like Othello and Macbeth and King Lear, not usually Midsummer Night's Dream. And if you think about the plays that I've just mentioned, they happen to be about great men above and beyond the ordinary who experience downfall. And if you read these plays, you'll see it's because of their flaws in character, but also because of outside forces. So you can see that Shakespeare is using this definition. But Shakespeare always changed things a little bit to suit his own purposes. So he didn't necessarily follow through with the particular definition, because in addition to the tragic hero being a great man and accepting responsibility and experiencing downfall because of outside forces and also because of flaws, this great man ultimately needed to accept responsibility for their part in the fall. And that's going to be very, very important when we get to characters like Jocasta in Oedipus the King. She could never be considered to be a tragic hero because she cares more about her own personal welfare and protecting herself than she does about protecting her community. If you remember in the play, she tells Oedipus to stop asking questions, even though she's already found out the truth. And this is quite telling about the kind of person that she is. As a ruler, she should be concerned with the welfare of the community as a whole, and putting that above her own welfare. That's not the case at all. Oedipus continues to seek out the truth, and he says, and of course we know this is ironic because we know the plot ahead of time, which is another reason why it's important that we know the plot ahead of time so we could appreciate the irony. When Oedipus says, I must pursue the truth even if I myself am guilty. And of course it turns out that he himself is guilty. But at least being an honorable man, he's willing to accept responsibility. What Oedipus does is, and many contemporary audiences have difficulty understanding why he would do this at the ending of the play, is he gouges out his eyes. So basically he punishes himself so he can live in a world of pain. And also thematically it's so appropriate because vision and blindness and eyes or lack of sight is such an important theme. We talked about Tiresias, who happens to be the blind prophet. Tiresias doesn't have vision, but he has insight. And by the ending of the play, Oedipus is the same. He doesn't have vision, but he has insight. So just because you have vision, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can see. But notice the contrast with Oedipus's actions as opposed to Jocasta. When the truth is revealed, she commits suicide. And the way that would be viewed in Greek society is as an escape, a cowardly action. In other words, she does not take responsibility for her actions. So she could never be considered a tragic hero. Now, in terms of thinking about the great man above and beyond the ordinary, well, obviously Oedipus is a great man above and beyond the ordinary because he's a king, so he has status. But keep in mind, he's also the great riddle solver. He solved the riddle of the Sphinx prior to the beginning of this play, which is why he has the kingdom, leading to more irony that he can't solve the riddle of his own birth. Again, that has to do with blindness, and that has to do with deliberate denial. And he also is, as I suggested earlier, more concerned with protecting his community than protecting himself. If he had followed Jocasta's advice by the ending of the play, yes, he could have protected himself and his nuclear family, but the plague would have continued on and would have continued to destroy the community. So he did the honorable thing, even though it led to his own descent and his own despair. And the idea that he has committed incest, though not deliberately, that plague has ravaged the community because of that, and that he ultimately loses his kingdom and has to live a life of pain and exile, I think is pretty clear to illustrate some of his downfall. The outside forces in this instance would be that fated prophecy. And this gets us back again to the idea of free will or predetermination. If the prophecy was predetermined, then Oedipus had no free will, and he was just merely fulfilling the prophecy. If the prophecy was merely foreknowledge, but Oedipus had free will, then that's a very different situation. But the irony, because again, irony is so important in this play, is that it is through Oedipus's actions to try to change his fate that he brings it about. And that gets back to the idea of his sin of hubris, of trying to outwit the gods. And it almost reminds me of a Twilight Zone episode with sort of the twist at the end. And what we can never know is what would have happened if Oedipus had decided not to take action. But the assumption is, at least based on our understanding of the gods in 430 BC, that if Oedipus had humbly accepted his fate, it wouldn't have come true. The only reason why his fate comes true is because he tries to outwit the gods. And if we continue with this line of reasoning, this goes further back than Oedipus. This goes all the way back to his birth parents, Jocasta and Laius, where when they are given the prophecy, they decide they need to take action and to try to stop this horrific prophecy from happening. They give their child away to be killed. And of course, we know that doesn't happen, and then the rest of the story unfolds. So the question is, if Oedipus's parents had humbly accepted their fate, would this horrible fate have come to fruition? So a lot of questions to consider in this particular play. In some ways, it almost reminds me of these time travel paradoxes, which have always hurt my head, actually, whenever I try to consider them. But nevertheless, some of the moral lessons for us, because plays during Greek society would be instructional as well as entertaining. Certainly don't engage in Oedipus's flaws, his hubris, his arrogance, his quick temper. And if we think about how he is contrasted with Creon, Creon is the exact opposite of Oedipus. Creon represents reason, rationality, even generosity. If you'll remember at the ending of the play, Creon allows Oedipus to say goodbye to his daughters. Oedipus is particularly concerned about the welfare of his daughters because at least the boys are going to be able to provide for themselves and they can make a living. But who will marry the girls as products of incest? Hence, how will they survive? So this is an act of generosity on Creon's part, especially because Creon was treated so badly by Oedipus. Remember, at one point, Oedipus even accuses Creon of lying and trying to steal the kingdom from him. And what Creon says is that, well, that's silly. Why would I want the kingdom? I have all of the privileges being part of the royal family as your brother-in-law, but none of the responsibilities of rule. And more irony is that it turns out that Creon actually becomes the king, even though that wasn't his intent by the ending of the play. I had indicated that this play is part of a trilogy. There is a 3-part story, and we're reading only the first part. The second part, and I believe you have this in your textbook, is Antigone. This happens to be the story of one of Oedipus's daughters, who is now an adult, and her interactions with King Creon, who is a much older king. And this is a very different Creon than what we saw in Oedipus the King. This Creon in Antigone is filled with hubris and arrogance and excessive pride and quick temper and blindness and denial. In other words, she's very much like Oedipus, which leads to the question, how much is it that the position of rule changes an individual's character or an individual's temperament. But that's for our second play. And then the third play, if we were to read it, which we aren't, but I know that you can find it online, even though it's not included necessarily in our textbook, is Oedipus at Colonus, where we get to revisit Oedipus now that he's been in exile for many, many years. So now he's an old man. Again, ironically, he's using that cane, not just because he's an old man, but remember that he's blind. And the irony is that that was the riddle that he was able to solve before Oedipus the King, the play even begins, when he defeated the riddle of the Sphinx. What walks on 4 legs in the morning, 3 legs in the afternoon, or 2 legs in the afternoon, and 3 in the evening? And the answer is man. 4 legs in the morning would be a baby crawling. 2 legs in the afternoon would be an adult walking. 3 legs in the evening, and that would be either an old man with a cane, or in Oedipus's case, at the ending of Oedipus the King, a blind man with the cane. So that said, thinking about how perhaps Creon and Oedipus could be compared and contrasted might be a very interesting paper topic or journal topic. Not that we have to consider papers or journals right at this point, but as I said, I'll be distributing some topics soon so that you can begin to contemplate. You might want to begin thinking now. Or comparing and contrasting, let's say, Oedipus and Jocasta. Jocasta is great in the sense that she's a queen, so she has status, but she hasn't established herself as a great riddle solver. And certainly she's not established herself as putting her own welfare below the welfare of the populace. In fact, it's quite opposite, so she's quite selfish and self-centered. Or even just examining one character, such as Tiresias, the blind prophet. And again, the irony that's associated with that, with being blind, but yet also having insight. And I really appreciated the dramatization that we saw that tried to duplicate what Oedipus the King might have looked like in 430 BC. And we've got these large padded costumes, as I had told you about, and these platform shoes to try to make these actors seem larger than life, which might seem ridiculous on camera, but wouldn't be ridiculous if we were watching this live on stage. And of course, they're large masks as well, so that we could differentiate one from another. It might also help to remove a little bit of their humanity as well. But note the color imagery that this production used that we happen to see. And again, this is just one interpretation of Oedipus the King. But the fact that Oedipus is wearing gold to represent royalty, and Jocasta is wearing silver, which is the next level down of royalty. And then the next level down would be the bronze of Creon. The fact that Tiresias, the blind prophet, is all in white because he has insight, but his eyes are so large and black and hollowed out because he's blind. And Oedipus's eyes are much larger than some of the other masks and black because while he does have sight, he lacks insight. And then, of course, the ending of the play when Oedipus is all in red, and red works so nicely in terms of blood, but it also suggests incest, which is a blood crime. So when Oedipus's daughters are revealed at the ending of the play, we see them in red because they're the products of incest. The black veil that Oedipus is wearing at the ending of the play to illustrate that now he has been blinded. Which also goes to something else that Aristotle had indicated about the plays, that action should also seem as realistic as possible on stage. Again, we are already suspending disbelief. So if you've got something that just can't realistically be portrayed on stage, let's say a monster like the Sphinx, or let's say a murder like King Laius's murder, or gouging out one's eyes the way Oedipus does, or a suicide as Jocasta does. This can be discussed, but the action should occur off stage because it would be too much of a stretch of our imaginations to try to envision that. So, thinking about the chorus, and I think we saw that very nicely in the production that we saw, that they work dual roles, both as populace, they're responding to action, but they also serve as narrators, so they can recap some of the action. And their chanting is quite musical. In fact, it almost acts like a kind of musical soundtrack. Some of the themes of the play, as I'd suggested, things like vision and blindness. That would be a great paper topic or journal topic. Light and dark, another great journal topic or paper topic. Irony, since this is perhaps one of the best known literary examples of irony that exists. The examination of what makes a tragic character and how Oedipus does fit into that role. That's another great paper topic. How ultimately, I think family is also an important theme. The sense of, yes, Oedipus is trying to protect his nuclear family, as is Jocasta. But as rulers, the community should also be their family as well. So they have a responsibility as rulers of taking care of the community, and they negate that possibility. So viewing all these different levels of family within the play, or as I suggested earlier, the conflict between fate and free will. So what I wanted to do next class was to talk a little bit about some of the quotes in Oedipus the King, give you a little bit of history about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's time and Shakespeare's language, which I know can be challenging. It is in English, so we're not reading a translation, but it's not our English. It's Middle English. It's not contemporary English. So there will be differences. But that said, when you are reading the plays, you don't necessarily have to understand each and every word. I want you to try to get an essence of the words in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And as I indicated, I will be making sure that we understand plot, which is notoriously complex in A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why next class. So that, again, it's less about trying to struggle with the plot and more about trying to understand some of the themes and some of the ways that Shakespeare uses language creatively. And as I indicated, we'll watch a performance. Actually, this was a performance that was shot in Shakespeare's Globe Theater, his reconstructed Globe Theater, and it was filmed in that theater. So it will try to give us a sense of what it would feel like to actually be present in that particular theater, though they have modernized some aspects of it. And this is going to mean that I am going to have to rely on the library to provide us with a streaming copy because of some copyright issues. So I can tell you a little bit more about that next class, but you should be hearing from the library about information about how you can stream that upcoming production that we will be viewing in class or during our class times of A Midsummer Night's Dream, much like we viewed a production of Oedipus the King. So I'll finish up with Oedipus next class, and then we'll move forward to Shakespeare and for our class attendance question again, which is due on Thursday the 23rd, and this would be at noon. Based on all of your understanding of Oedipus and this discussion about Oedipus, what do you think is Oedipus's major flaw and why? So I hope you're all doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class with drama. Take care. Bye-bye.